What's up, folks? Casual Dad here with another quick faction breakdown. This time, by request, I'm going to go ahead and do Servants of the Emperor. And we're just going to go left to right here. I'll talk about each individual warlord, kind of their strengths and weaknesses, and then also go through some of the top cards in the set. Servants kind of do everything. They're a pretty cool faction, and they end up being one of the most powerful competitive factions out there. I see a ton of them in the upper ranks, especially Canoness and Greyfax. I'm sure you do see them as well. And I'll talk more about those two in detail in a second here. Yeah, let's just dive right in. So coming in at 16 points, the cheapest by far is going to be Commissar Yarrick, the old Baali himself. He's got a couple videos about him. He's epic, so he does get 2 traits. He gets up to rank 4 Inspire, and then up to rank 2 Furious Charge. So he does beef up his own attacks, and then also his companions, and then also will attack a little bit on the drop. Now, even at max level, his stats are really unimpressive. Doesn't even hit 200 hit points, only gets to 53 melee, but that's to be expected because he is 16 points. And also his ability is that whenever a friendly card dies, another random friendly card will ready for a twice, I think that is. It's roughly twice, maybe a little bit over. It's a really good ability, especially in a faction that has a lot of cards that are expendable. So you've got your 2 endless cards here coming in at 4 and 5 points respectively. Those are very, very common to see. You've also got some taunt cards. Everything in this top row here is 5 points or under. So from this guy up is 5 points or under and gets up to 3. So you can certainly get a lot of that benefit really quickly. A couple things to note about it is random. So if you have mixed cards that ready for different kinds of values, like some are range, some are melee, some are psychic, you won't get as much benefit out of it because you don't have that consistency in what the readies do. Really common thing to see with Yarrick is the really heavy shooting decks that lean on your big tanks, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. But your heavy hitting cards that do ranged attacks, and then your kind of ablative cards that you can lose without too much trouble. He was one of the warlords that I was really successful with starting out, but I rarely play him now, just because he's outshone by most of the others. He's definitely one of the first ones to pick up in a campaign, because he often does do the bonus, and again, being the cheapest, lets you really cram stuff into that deck that gives you your max bonus for that. So there's Yarrick himself. Yeah, trying to figure out if I missed anything there. I don't think so. Next up, we have the Magus. Comes in a little bit higher at 23 points. He does break 200 hit points, and then also has the Medicae trait. Only one trait because he's only rare. But that is a pretty significant chunk of hit points. Leans a little bit more in ranged, not terribly impressive on the melee. And his ability is, anytime a friendly card dies, every other card on the board gets plus 20 hit points. Now it's important to note that and Yarrick, all of these abilities, also apply to the second copy of an endless card. So if you have your guardsman on the table, it dies, comes back for the second copy will also receive the benefit, and can be the card that readies for Yarrick. That's an important thing to note there. It's a very defensive ability. It's important to note it's not the same as Rakarth because it only applies to the cards you have on the board. So it is still good. That flat 20 health is pretty amazing, especially if paired with regen, shields, or fear. Magus decks can get really, really powerful. And he's also on the lower end of the point scale, so if you throw a couple taunts in there, he can really keep your really heavy ranged hitters alive for a little bit longer, which is really nice. So he's decent. I've talked to a couple top tier players who say that he's their actual go-to Servants of the Emperor Warlord. He's, I think, underrated, but he's not one you're going to see very often, and I personally don't play with him very much except for quests. But he's there. If he works with your aesthetic, go for it. Next up, we have Creed. Now here we're going to see a giant bump in power. He's only 1 point more, and the Warlord himself is truly unimpressive. Highest hit points we've had so far, but his attack stats are middling, and doesn't have the Medicae drop like we saw on the Magus, so he doesn't end up any more durable. He does have Outflank, and being epic, he can get trait 4 Outflank and trait 2 Inspire, both of which aren't nothing, especially because his ability is whenever a friendly card dies, every other friendly card on the board comes back to your hand, up to twice. So that's really similar to Lilith, with the difference being that the card that gets bounced doesn't have to actually get a kill. So you can it's better and worse. The thing about Lilith is her ability doesn't rely on any of your cards dying, which is great. The thing about Creed is that it doesn't require your cards to get the kill. So Creed is actually much better with shields, because a lot of the heavily shielded cards in Servants don't have very impressive attack stats. So if you throw a Taunt or an Endless on there, you can have basically infinite shields with Creed, which is one of the more powerful things you see done with him in higher powered decks. You can see a really heavy Custodians deck do extremely well with Creed. For me personally, I end up doing a lot of ranged attacks. My personal favorite cards to pair with him are, of course, the Tank. It's got the attack on drop, and as it's redeployed to your hand, it reloads that, so you can keep dropping it repeatedly. And then also the Dominator I've been using a lot recently because it has that outflank trait. So it's a combination of buffing your attacks and debuffing your opponent each time you redeploy it, and stack a couple levels in there, and it is very scary. I've been doing really well with him up in the 3k range with just the level 4 that only has that 81 range damage. But it's going to be significantly more effective once I get up a little bit in terms of that barrage, ranged attack, and then also its hit points, which you see get quite terrifying at the top there. Creed is one of the better ones. He still does struggle with the same issue that all of these first 4 do, where his ability relies on your cards dying, which is a really tricky balance to take, because you want to load these guys up because they're the cheaper ones. You want to load them up with more powerful cards, but you have to balance that with stuff that's going to trigger their abilities. And there are 2 ways to do that. The one is to include cheap Endless cards and Taunt cards, and then just really, really go ham with the powerful cards to fill it out. I find that can lose to attrition decks pretty quickly, and you end up with Creed or any of these other Warlords on the board, which is not a position you want to be in, because they will not last long. So with him, I tend to lean towards having just a more durable deck and not getting as many redeploys, but the ones that you do get are absolutely clutch. So you lose some of your power pieces a little bit more quickly, but you have more kind of depth to the deck rather than just bleeding cards the way that you're kind of tempted to maximize the ability. And I could show the deck on that in a little bit, but let's go ahead and keep going through the list. Next up we have Canoness, one of the shielded Warlords, which makes her really pretty obnoxious in the endgame. Comes in just a couple points higher than Creed, ends up with decent hit points that are considerably beefed up by those shields, and then also has that rank 2 Inspire because she is epic as well. And her ability is, whenever a friendly servant's card dies, one of your other cards makes an attack for 75% of its melee stat. So it's not a full attack, but it's just a hair worse than just getting a free Furious Charge rank 3, which I believe hits for 80% of its base attack stat. So it's a significant amount of damage, especially if you have those Taunt and Endless cards in there. And then if you have something backing it up, like this guy, which of course is an extremely powerful card in a deck like that. Not only can it get multiple free attacks because of Canoness's ability, but then it also has Death Blow, so it can really make an impact very quickly. Another rockstar for Canoness is going to be Celestine. I've talked about Endless cards a lot, but it's important to note that she is now Endless, has a ton of hit points, so she's not going to die a lot or very quickly. So she may outlive the cards that you want to use to trigger on death abilities, but she's really powerful with a bunch of stats and is particularly good in a Canoness deck because, again, she's Endless and can trigger the abilities, but also has high stats and a good melee attack, plus that Inspire. Yeah, so really solid card. Those are 2 that I try to include in every Canoness deck, but it's always a little bit tricky to figure out the balance there. Same issue with the others. She's the 4th of the Warlords who relies on cards dying to trigger her ability. It's another case where you can build a deck around being really good, just generally flat good, and then when a card dies, trigger her ability and not worry about that too much. So you don't have to have half of your deck be weak cards you expect to die. You can just get the benefit as your tougher, beefier melee cards start to take losses. A key thing to watch out with her is it is random which card does it. And so you do want to make sure that every single one of your cards has a meaningful melee attack. Otherwise, you could end up in a situation where you have multiple free attacks that do nothing because it's a card that doesn't have a melee attack, such as, right buddy, this guy. Nothing. So it will actually trigger on him, but he won't do any damage at all. Likewise, these Endless cards, these are some of the best cards to trigger her ability, but if the first copy is killed, the second copy comes back, and this could be the one that triggers that melee attack stat. And 75% of 6 is not very impressive. If you're playing that way, it is good to put these guys in front of a shielded card because it will at least clear a shield, a minimum. So that's not as bad. But still, it's a real bummer when you're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do 90 damage with this attack, and you do like 5. So that's the thing about it. She is shielded and a little bit beefier, and her ability can trigger on herself. So she's pretty good, and you do see Canoness a lot in competitive tiers just because she's an incredibly powerful card, and that ability can be absolutely bonkers. Like, you could have an endgame where this thing attacks 4 times just because you have a couple endless cards die in quick succession, and then it returns fire with melee. So it can be totally overwhelming, and then it can completely fall flat right when you need it to trigger well. So the randomness effect is always a challenge for me, but she's still very good and one of the warlords that I've been running with this season. Next up we have Greyfax. I did an individual guide with her, but if you're looking for raw stats, there is no one better. This looks good, but doesn't look terribly impressive until you understand that her ability also is, and we've talked about this, if you leave points unspent when building your deck, you get a % buff to all stats of every card in your deck. It's pretty typical to get around 30% bonus. You can get up to 75%, which if you look at these stats and multiply those by 1.75, it gets real scary, especially in combination with that Inspire and Big Game Hunter, and her being legendary, she can get both up to rank 4. She's extremely scary. It's always tricky, though, to balance what cards you put in there. You can have a full deck where every single card is like a 5-point card, in which case it becomes very, very scary, but never has quite the same damage output as kind of a mid-tier card. And I've talked about this before. I like decks with her that are, I want to say 5 to 6 cards. Let's see. Give or take. Yeah, 5 to 6 is about right. And lean in like the 15-point range with cards that have particularly good stats that benefit from the ability, both by not costing too many points, but also getting a lot of bonus from her stat boost. So if they have a high flat out stat, like this guy's a great one, comes in at 15 points, decent hit points, and does that relatively high ranged attack, he's very, very good. One I've been using a lot right now that I'm really enjoying, though, is, I splurged a bit on this one. This one. This thing is nuts. You'd be, like, it's regularly dishing out 100 damage per shot, has just shy of greater demon health, it has a melee attack, and has regen, and can do damage on the drop. This guy's been great for me. Loving it. So that guy, but some of the decks that have beaten me up the most aggressively with Greyfax I've talked about before being just all these guys. It's all the Tanith first. You can do a deck that's just all of them. It's got all of your tools. It's low cost, decent stats. So it's a really, really powerful deck that has all the options you would want and plays very much like your classic Imperial Guard, but the greatest hits, best heroes of the Imperial Guard. That's a really fun one. Or you can opt to go super small and just throw something like this in there and then a bunch of other cheap cards and just make the Penitent engine just completely nuts. That's one way you can do it. You can really do anything with Greyfax, which is the blessing and curse of her. And I do have an individual guide specifically about Greyfax if you want to learn more about counters and how to beat her, because I know she's definitely a challenge for a lot of newer players because of the way that matchmaking works. You end up hitting her decks earlier than you probably should. So that is something to keep in mind. But really powerful Warlord, very good one if you get the chance. And then last but not least, I would actually argue that, well, one more thing on Greyfax. It's very typical to see Psychic Greyfax decks because Fear and cards like this one and this guy, if you have that stat boost plus area effect psychic powers, they can really add up and make an incredibly devastating deck. And then of course this guy with a bunch of extra hit points and fear makes him very frightening, especially with that added trait. If you get him up to the point where he does area effect, you can have this guy, the Navigator, and then also your bigger Psyker, this guy. All 3 of them doing area effect psychic damage at the start of each turn, which can really quickly melt just about anything they end up against. They are on the more expensive side, especially if you put them all together, so you end up with a lower bonus, but it can definitely be one of the more powerful builds. Last but not least, I personally think that Morvenn Vahl is actually the most powerful of the Servants Warlords, just flat out. She's legendary, she's new, she's rare. It's pretty hard to level her up, but just look at these stats. She's legendary, so she gets rank 4 Fear, rank 4 Inspire, base damage of 98 at max health and 300 hit points. With that fear, and then those stats, that makes her just an absolute monster in a fight, again with that Inspire. But then also her ability is just, whenever you deploy a card, it gets a sort of a soft shield, where the first 3 hits it takes of any kind of damage, it will reduce that damage by 30%. Doesn't matter if it's a target acquired shot, doesn't matter if it's area effect from a barrage shot, whatever it is, flat 30% reduction in damage. Similar to shields, it is easy to strip, but it does stack. So if you have a card with taunt, it's an additive effect. So if the taunt is giving a negative 25% damage resistance, combined with that, it's negative 55, which adds up real fast. Especially if you sprinkle in some fear. You've got a card under the effects of fear attacking a taunt card that has Morvenn Vahl's ability on it. That card is not going to die. Your taunt becomes incredibly powerful in this case. You've got taunt, you've got berserk, you've got regeneration. All will just make cards just stick around in a Vahl deck and really be able to do what they do best really, really well. One big thing to note is it does these 30% reduction layers, the 3 of them will be stripped at the same time as shields. So I personally do not recommend shielded cards in a Vahl deck because it's kind of redundant. It's still preventing all damage as opposed to preventing 30%, but it's really best to throw in some cards with her that benefit from that damage reduction without having shields, because that basically negates her ability. The only exception I would say for that is the cheaper shielded cards. Where are you? This one. She's actually a really good one to include in there because she doesn't have a ton of hit points, and if you combine shields with Vahl's damage reduction, you can put her in front of something like a Long Strike and have an 11-point card that can take those hits without going down quickly. She becomes incredibly hard to shift, where before some of the really powerful decks can just bust right through those shields and kill her outright. So that is a case where I would be tempted to include both shields and Vahl herself. Also, if you get rank 4, you have 1 more shield than Vahl's ability, so there is that. But my favorite cards to include with her are, of course, your kind of classic performers. This guy is not very tough, but if you do a 30% damage reduction on him, really helps him last, and he's very cheap, so you can kind of sprinkle him into a deck. He's got the same utility, good damage output, will strip shields and damage reduction off enemy cards. Great to put in there, even if the deck isn't themed around psychic attacks. But probably the biggest performer for her... Where are you, buddy? Strachan. My Strachan is embarrassingly low level, but you get this guy up here in this range where he's sitting on multi-level berserk and regen and that damage reduction. He can ramp up incredible amounts of damage and be really, really hard to remove. And he's flexible. He can do both melee and shooting, which most of the best Vahl cards can do. It ends up being a very flexible deck that can switch off between melee and shooting very easily. Some other standouts for me, and one of my favorite things about this is these are cards that you can include in other decks but aren't necessarily go-tos, but they're just built for Vahl. And that goes to this guy too. The Inquisitor has Fear and Inspire together, plus that damage reduction and a big chunk of health and good damage stats. That is just a horrifying matchup to go up against. And it's one of those abilities where it's kind of subtle. You tend to underrate it if you're looking at building a deck or playing with Vahl, but then once you play it or play against it, more to the point, you can really see how it can be absolutely devastating and how much of a difference that damage reduction actually makes. This guy's another great choice, just again because of that Enrage, and he's also got that Death Blow to kind of add a little extra damage output. And then, of course, my favorite, the 025. Terrific stats, regen, good hit points. Not going to be quite as good as in a Greyfax deck, but he's still only 22 points, which is a lot less if you're going for full deck points than in a Greyfax deck where you're trying to spend as few as possible. So again, I do think that Vahl is probably the most powerful Servant's Warlord, which may seem crazy, but her ability doesn't require you to have cards die, doesn't require you to not fill your deck. Her stats themselves are just absolutely incredible, and there's no card that's bad in the deck with her, except potentially shields. I think that's kind of where we're at with all the Warlords. Of course, holler and drop a comment if you have any questions about these. One thing I want to make sure I did mention is that, kind of going through these, just as a real quick archetype thing, Yarrick you want to do ranged. You can do melee, but it's not good. Magus you can do either, but he's really kind of themed around regen and Definitely does well with some of the heavier hitting ranged cards, and his ability helps them stay alive for longer to really do their devastating damage. Creed, I also think benefits from ranged, but he can do an incredibly scary melee shield deck with all of those custodians you get down here. You got your outflank on this guy, not shielded, but he's a nice piece to fit into a Creed deck. Then you get your shields, of course, and then you got your other shields. These guys just get super obnoxious if you start refreshing their shields multiple times. Still hit pretty hard. And then if you back them up with someone like Valoris himself, who dishes out a ton of damage and then can redeploy on taunt cards, that's good. But I still think that ranged is going to be a little bit better. If melee is your thing, you can do Greyfax, of course. But then also the Canoness is really your go-to. And for melee cards, some of the standouts are going to be this guy, who does just crazy amounts of damage, especially for 11 points. Like, this guy gets completely nuts, especially if you stack on the durability from Vahl or the damage boost from Greyfax, or being able to attack multiple times beyond his Furious Charge with the Canoness. Great one. And also, he's not that sturdy, so it puts out a bunch of damage output, but also is a card you kind of expect to die. You put him up against something scary, try to kill it, and then he's going to die to trigger one of your other abilities. So he's just shoe-in, perfect Servants of the Emperor card if you're doing melee, or have a mix of both. And then some other cards, of course, your taunts. Your cheap taunt being... this guy is very common. He's a taunt card with decent health, extremely cheap, so he kind of gets sprinkled in all those decks where you want a card to die. Or in a Vahl deck, this guy is one of the most durable taunt cards in the game, which is very funny on a 9-point taunt, unless you're up against it. This guy, of course, comes in. He's a 7-point Inspire, which is really nice. He's got both melee and ranged. He ends up being a filler in a lot of my decks. Again, also one that has a lot of benefit, is cheap, and also one you would expect to die, so he can trigger abilities for you. One I never leave home without, in almost any deck, anytime I can squeeze it in there, is your classic Poison guy. Poison's a super powerful ability. I like having as much of it as possible, but if you have the option to take an 8-point dude who can really throw down that damage and kind of help you work through fear and shields, great one to bring in. And again, relatively killable, so he's a great one to trigger those on-death abilities for a lot of these warlords. But you want to keep him alive as often as you can, or as long as you can. Kind of going through here again, one of my favorite cards is one that's not all that good, but again, really goes well in a Vahl deck. It's going to be Harker. Surprisingly good, especially for his price point. He can really rack up a lot of damage output, especially in a ranged deck where you have some ways to help him take damage but reduce the kind of volume, so give him some time to build up. So he does well in a Vahl deck. He also does well in a Greyfax deck, because that gives him a little bit of extra cushion. And then, of course, I talked about the Psychers. This thing is good in pretty much any shooting deck. The cost for the amount of damage you get and the hit points is terrific. It's a great value piece if you get a couple levels in there. And then, of course, your Assassins are really, really top-notch. This one's probably the best target acquired card in the game, ? I probably will not stand by that if challenged. But it's one of the classic ones you see a lot because of that, especially now having gained that precision shot, so he shoots on drop too. So you can strip off a last shield, or kind of strip off an injured card so you can do some flanking stuff. Let's see. There are a lot of really powerful pieces in Servants, but they're kind of all over the place that do all sorts of different things. One other one that I personally like a lot is, of course, Call. He's kind of in or out of my decks. He can end up being just the most obnoxious, unkillable stick in the mud with that and at max level he does have pretty significant stats and really high health, especially coming in with Medicae. Too expensive for a Greyfax deck, but definitely useful in most others. And those stats make him totally reasonable to put in any offensive deck you want. So he's really good. Again, does particularly well in a Vahl deck, just making it that much harder to move, and having the damage output to hold down a flank and not be totally useless. Of course, some of your standard shooting cards come up a lot. They're ones you're going to see a lot and are really, really good. That being the tank that we talked about already, Leman Russ, pardon. The Basilisk, which has a really strong barrage. Does not have any kind of melee attack, so that makes it a little iffy, but the price point for the hit points and the damage output is really good. Really nice against those Akaran decks or for stripping some of those endless cards out there. Then, of course, you've got your Dune Crawler, is also a really powerful one, has that precision shot. Great card to throw out there. I'm not going to talk about everyone. Those are kind of the ones I wanted to highlight. One, I would love for someone to change my mind about. Draxus sucks. She does have attack in every single stat, but nah. For the cost and what you get, not going to compete with any of the Slaanesh cards that have attack in every single stat, or any of the like Farseer cards that have attack in every single stat. She's just not good enough. And getting that poison as a secondary trait is just laughable, because that means at most it does, what, 8? Yeah, so at absolute maximum level, she has a semi-worthwhile poison damage of 8. Before then, she's just Berserk food. I don't like it. I would argue that she's probably the worst card in the faction, which is a real bummer, because it's a cool concept. I'd like to see her be more useful, but nah. So yeah, if someone wants to pick a fight with me on that one, let's do it. Anyway, there's my full faction breakdown. I hope that was useful, and yeah, holler if you want to see anything else.